The champagne-colored envelope sat on my desk like an accusation. Fort Carson's morning light filtered through my office blinds, casting geometric shadows across the thick cardstock that bore my name in elegant script. Major General Diana Martinez. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'd been staring at it for 23 minutes. My aide, Sergeant First Class Thompson, had delivered it with the rest of the morning correspondence, but this one stood apart from the usual stack of briefings and memorandums. The return address made my chest tighten. The Whitman family, 2847 Maple Grove Lane, Denver, Colorado. Whitman, my maiden name. The name I'd shed like old skin when I married David, 12 years ago, only to reclaim it after the divorce papers were signed. But they'd never used it for me, not since I left home at 18, with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to prove myself somewhere, anywhere that wasn't under their roof. The postmark was 3 days old. Inside, I could feel the weight of what I already knew was coming. Sarah was getting married. My little sister, the golden child who could do no wrong, was finally tying the knot. The sister who hadn't spoken to me in 7 years, not since our father's funeral when she'd stood beside our mother and watched me sit alone in the back row, still in my dress blues, still unwelcome at my own family's table. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. Expensive paper. Sarah always did like the finer things, even when our family could barely afford them. She'd probably spent weeks choosing the perfect invitation, the perfect words, the perfect way to extend an olive branch, disguised as obligation. The seal broke with a crisp snap. Inside, layers of tissue paper protected an invitation that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment. Gold foil lettering announced the union of Sarah Elizabeth Whitman and Captain James Mitchell Thompson. The date was circled in my mind before I even processed it. 3 weeks away. A Saturday afternoon ceremony at the Cathedral of St. Andrew, followed by a reception at the Denver Country Club. Captain Thompson. The name rattled around in my skull like a marble in a tin can. I knew that name. I'd seen it on deployment rosters, commendation reports, after-action reviews. Jimmy Thompson from the 82nd Airborne. The same Jimmy Thompson I'd pulled out of a collapsed building in Kandahar province during my second tour as a lieutenant colonel. The same Jimmy Thompson who'd looked up at me through blood and dust and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, I owe you everything." The irony wasn't lost on me. 7 years of silence from my family, and now Sarah was marrying a soldier I'd saved. A soldier who probably had no idea that his bride-to-be had a sister in the army, let alone one who outranked him by several grades. I set the invitation down and walked to my window. The parade ground stretched out below, morning PT formations moving in precise patterns across the asphalt. Young soldiers running in formation, their cadence echoing off the brick buildings that had become more home to me than anywhere else. This was my world now. These people understood duty, honor, and sacrifice. They understood what it meant to earn respect through blood, sweat, and unwavering commitment to something larger than yourself. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. A woman in her early 40s, silver stars gleaming on my collar, ribbons telling stories of places most people couldn't pronounce. I'd come a long way from the scared 18-year-old who'd walked into the recruitment office in downtown Denver, desperate to escape a family that saw her as nothing more than a disappointment wrapped in defiance. The phone on my desk buzzed. Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ma'am, Colonel Harrison is here for your 0900 briefing. Send him in," I replied, not moving from the window. But my mind wasn't on briefings or tactical assessments. It was spinning through calculations, possibilities, consequences. Sarah was marrying Jimmy Thompson who'd served under my command in Afghanistan. Jimmy Thompson who'd received the Bronze Star for Valor after our unit's engagement with insurgent forces outside of Kabul. Jimmy Thompson who'd written me a letter after his medical discharge, thanking me for my leadership and telling me I was the finest officer he'd ever served under. Did Sarah know? Did she have any idea that her estranged sister had saved her future husband's life? That the woman they'd systematically erased from family photos and holiday cards was the reason Jimmy was alive to marry her at all. Colonel Harrison knocked and entered, his arms full of intelligence folders. "Good morning, General. Ready to review the quarterly assessment report." I turned from the window, forcing my focus back to the present. "Let's get started, Colonel." But even as we discussed troop readiness and budget allocations, part of my mind remained fixed on that invitation, on the decision I knew I was going to make, even though every rational part of my brain screamed against it. After Harrison left, I sat back down at my desk and pulled up my computer. The airline website loaded quickly. Denver International Airport, one-way ticket. I could be there in 4 hours, back in time for Monday morning briefings. No one would even know I'd left. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. 7 years of birthdays without calls, holidays without invitations, major life events happening in a vacuum of silence. They'd made their choice about my place in their lives a long time ago. But Jimmy Thompson was different. Jimmy Thompson knew who I was, what I'd done, what I represent. Jimmy Thompson had called me ma'am with genuine respect in his voice, even as medics worked to stop the bleeding from his leg wound. I thought about my mother's face at Dad's funeral, the way she'd turned away when I approached the casket, as if my presence somehow diminished the solemnity of the moment, the way she'd whispered to Sarah and my Aunt Margaret, just loud enough for me to hear. She always has to make everything about her military career. The military career that had taken me from the housing projects of North Denver to commanding thousands of soldiers. The military career that had earned me respect on every continent, except the one where I'd grown up. The military career that meant nothing to the people who shared my DNA. I closed my laptop without booking the flight. Then I opened it again. The cursor blinked in the departure city field like a heartbeat. Fort Carson to Denver. Morning departure. Evening return. I could slip in and out like a ghost, watch my sister marry the man I'd saved, and leave without disrupting their carefully curated narrative. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I wasn't the girl who hid in corners hoping not to be noticed. I was Major General Diana Martinez, and I'd earned every star on my collar through blood, determination, and an absolute refusal to be invisible. I booked the flight. The confirmation email arrived 30 seconds later, and with it, a strange sense of calm. I wasn't going to Denver to reconcile. I wasn't going to beg for acceptance, or apologize for becoming someone they couldn't categorize or control. I was going because Jimmy Thompson deserved to know that the woman who'd saved his life would be there to witness the most important day of his civilian life. Whether my family wanted me there or not, the wedding was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prepare for a confrontation I'd been avoiding for 7 years. 3 weeks to decide whether I was ready to face the people who'd taught me that love came with conditions, and respect had to be earned by becoming someone smaller than you were meant to be. I picked up the invitation one more time, reading Sarah's name in that perfect calligraphy. My little sister who'd always been prettier, more agreeable, more willing to mold herself into whatever shape our parents required. Sarah who'd never questioned why I left or wondered if maybe our family's version of events wasn't the whole truth. Sarah who was about to marry a man who knew exactly who her sister really was. Outside my window the flag snapped in the Colorado wind, the stars and stripes catching the afternoon light. Soon I'd be trading these mountains for the flat plains of eastern Colorado, this office for a church pew, this uniform for whatever armor I could find in my civilian wardrobe. But I'd still be Major General Diana Martinez, and Jimmy Thompson would still recognize me, even if my own family pretended they didn't. The memories came flooding back as I sat in my quarters that evening, the invitation propped against my bedside lamp like evidence in a trial I'd never been allowed to defend myself in. 24 years. That's how long it had been since I'd first told my parents I wanted to join the military, and their reaction still echoed in my chest like shrapnel from an old wound. I was 17, a senior at Lincoln High School in Denver's Stapleton neighborhood. Our house was a narrow 2-story with peeling paint and a front yard that never quite looked maintained despite my father's weekend efforts. Money was always tight. Dad worked double shifts at the Budweiser plant, and Mom cleaned houses for families in Cherry Hills Village who paid her just enough to keep coming back, but not enough to ever join their ranks. Sarah was 13 then, already showing signs of the beauty that would eventually make her homecoming queen. She had Mom's delicate features and Dad's easy smile, the kind of combination that made teachers remember her name and neighbors comment on how well she was growing up. I had Dad's stubborn jaw and Mom's intensity, which translated into teachers calling me difficult and neighbors whispering about how I needed to learn my place. The Army recruiter had come to our school during lunch. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez set up a table in the cafeteria, surrounded by glossy brochures showing soldiers in exotic locations, promises of education benefits and career opportunities that seemed like science fiction to kids from our zip code. While my classmates walked past with barely a glance, I found myself standing there for 20 minutes, asking questions about basic training, deployment schedules, and what it really meant to serve your country. That night at dinner, I made the mistake of bringing it up. Mom's fork clattered against her plate like a gavel. "Diana, you're talking nonsense. Girls from our family don't go into the military. What do girls from our family do?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. None of the women in our extended family had careers that extended beyond the neighborhood boundaries. They married young, had children, and spent their lives making sure everyone else's needs were met before considering their own. "They stay close to home," Dad said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and expectation. "They take care of their family. They don't go running off to play soldiers in some foreign country." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "I'm not playing anything," I'd shot back. "This is about college money, about learning skills, about abandoning your responsibilities here." Mom interrupted. "Sarah's going to need help getting through high school. Your father's back isn't going to hold up forever. This family needs you here, not scattered across the globe, pretending you're something you're not." Sarah had looked up from her homework, confused by the tension crackling across the dinner table. At 13, she still believed that families were supposed to support each other's dreams, that love meant wanting the best for someone even if it took them away from you. "Maybe Diana could help people by being a soldier," she'd said quietly, "like on TV where they help after earthquakes and stuff." The silence that followed was arctic. Mom's face had hardened into that expression I knew so well, the one that meant I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. "Sarah, finish your homework," she'd said without taking her eyes off me. "Diana, this conversation is over. You'll apply to Metro State, like we discussed. You'll study something practical, and you'll stop filling your head with these ridiculous ideas about running away from your family." But I hadn't stopped. Over the next few months, I'd met with Sergeant Rodriguez 3 more times, always during school hours, always in secret. He'd explained the different career fields, the testing requirements, the commitment involved. He'd also been honest about the challenges I'd face as a woman in a male-dominated environment, and how military life could strain family relationships. "Some families don't understand at first," he'd told me during our final meeting. "But most come around when they see how much you grow, how much you accomplish. The military teaches you to be your best self, and families usually recognize that eventually." I'd believed him. I'd believed that my parents would eventually see my success and be proud, that they'd understand. I wasn't rejecting them, just choosing a different path. I'd been wrong. The night before graduation, I'd told them I'd enlisted, not asked, told. I was 18, legally an adult, and I'd signed the papers that afternoon. My ship date for basic training was 6 weeks away. Mom had cried. Not the proud tears of a mother watching her daughter chase her dreams, but the bitter tears of someone who felt betrayed. Dad had stormed out of the house and didn't come back until after midnight, smelling like beer and disappointment. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Mom had said when we were alone in the kitchen. "And you're breaking up this family to do it." "I'm not breaking up anything," I protested. "I'll write letters, I'll call when I can. I'll come home on leave." "You'll come home a stranger," she'd cut me off. "You'll come home thinking you're better than us, thinking you know more than the people who raised you. The military changes people, Diana. It makes them hard. It makes them forget where they come from." Sarah had been different during those final weeks. She'd oscillate between excitement about my upcoming adventure and anxiety about being left alone to manage our parents' expectations. One night, she'd crawled into my bed like she used to when we were little. "Are you really going to be gone for years?" she'd whispered. "Basic training is just 4 months." I'd explained. "Then I'll be stationed somewhere, but I'll get leave time. I'll visit whenever I can. But you'll be different, won't you? Mom says the army will change you." I'd struggled with how to answer that. Part of me hoped the army would change me, that it would make me stronger, more confident, more capable. But I didn't want Sarah to think I was rejecting who I'd been with her. "I'll still be your sister," I'd promised. "That will never change." But it had changed. Everything had changed. The first letters I'd sent from Fort Benning had gone unanswered. My phone calls home were brief, stilted conversations where Mom asked about my health, but never about my training, my goals, or my growing sense of purpose. When I called to tell them I'd been selected for officer candidate school, Mom had handed the phone to Dad without saying a word. "That's nice, sweetheart," Dad had said, but his voice sounded like he was talking to a distant relative, not his daughter. By the time I'd graduated as a second lieutenant, the calls had stopped altogether. I'd sent my promotion photo to the house, thinking maybe seeing me in my dress blues would help them understand that this wasn't a phase or a rebellion. It was my life, my career, my calling. The photo came back 3 weeks later with "return to sender," written in Mom's handwriting. Sarah had been the only bridge for a while. She'd call me at my first duty station in Georgia, updating me on high school drama and asking careful questions about military life. But even those conversations felt strained, as if she was torn between loyalty to me and loyalty to our parents' version of reality. "They miss you," she'd tell me. "They just don't know how to talk about what you're doing. They could start by acknowledging that I exist," I'd reply, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. But Sarah was young, caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand. Over time, her calls became less frequent, our conversations shorter. When she'd started dating in high school, she'd stopped mentioning me to her friends. When she'd graduated, I'd learned about it from a Facebook post, not an invitation. The final break had come at Dad's funeral, 7 years ago. I'd flown back from my deployment in Iraq, still carrying the dust of Fallujah in my boots and the weight of command decisions in my shoulders. I'd been a lieutenant colonel then, responsible for over 1,000 soldiers, decorated for valor, respected by my peers. None of that had mattered when I'd walked into Unlinger Crown Hill Mortuary. Mom had been sitting in the front row between Sarah and Aunt Margaret, receiving condolences from a steady stream of neighbors and coworkers. When she'd seen me approaching in my dress blues, her face had hardened into that familiar mask of disapproval. "This isn't about you, Diana," she'd whispered when I'd leaned down to hug her. "Don't make it about your career." I'd stepped back, stung. "I'm here because he was my father. You're here in that uniform because you want people to know how important you think you are," she'd hissed back. "Take off those ribbons and sit in the back. Let this be about him, not about you." Sarah had watched the exchange with wide eyes, but she hadn't said anything. She'd just looked away when I'd tried to catch her gaze, as if my presence was somehow embarrassing. I'd sat in the back row, alone, while my father was eulogized by people who spoke about his love for his family, the family that apparently didn't include his eldest daughter. When the service ended, I'd approached the casket to say goodbye, and Mom had actually stepped between us. "I think you've done enough," she'd said quietly. "Maybe it's time for you to go back to wherever you came from." I'd left that day and hadn't spoken to any of them since. Until now. Until an invitation to watch my sister marry the man I'd saved in the mountains of Afghanistan. A man who had no idea that his bride's family had spent decades trying to erase the woman who'd given him a second chance at life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. As I sat in my quarters reviewing personnel files, my mind drifted to the journey that had brought me from that broken girl, leaving Denver, to the woman who now commanded the respect of thousands. The path had been carved through determination, mentorship, and moments of clarity that had nothing to do with the family that rejected me. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen had been the first person to see potential in me beyond my obvious anger. I'd been a newly minted second lieutenant at Fort Stewart, fresh out of officer basic course and carrying a chip on my shoulder the size of Colorado. My platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams, had already filed 2 counseling statements about my attitude problems and difficulty accepting feedback. I wasn't difficult. I was defensive. Every correction felt like an attack, every suggestion like proof that I didn't belong. I'd spent so many years having my judgment questioned at home that I'd arrived in the Army ready to fight battles that didn't exist. Chen had called me into his office on a humid Georgia afternoon, 3 months into my first assignment. His office was spartanly decorated, a few commendation certificates, a photo of his wife and twin daughters, and a bookshelf filled with military history and leadership texts. He gestured to the chair across from his desk without looking up from the paperwork he was reviewing. "Lieutenant Martinez," he'd said finally, setting down his pen. "Tell me why you joined the Army." The question had caught me off guard. I'd expected another lecture about attitude adjustment or team dynamics. Instead, he was asking about motivation. "To serve my country, sir," I replied automatically. He'd leaned back in his chair, studying me with dark eyes that seemed to look past my rehearsed answers. "That's what you're supposed to say." "I'm asking what you actually think." I hesitated, then decided honesty couldn't make my situation worse. "To prove I could do something that mattered, sir. To become someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed." "Ah," he nodded. "You're running towards something, not away from it." "That's good. But you're also fighting ghosts, and that's going to get you killed. Or worse, get your soldiers killed." Over the next hour, Chen had laid out a truth I wasn't ready to hear but desperately needed to understand. The Army didn't care about my family drama. My soldiers wouldn't follow me because they felt sorry for my background or impressed by my resentment. Leadership was earned through competence, consistency, and the ability to put others' needs before your own ego. "You want to matter?" he'd asked as our session ended. "Stop trying to prove you belong, and start proving you can lead. Stop waiting for recognition, and start earning it. And stop carrying your family's limitations like they're your own." Chen had become my unofficial mentor, guiding me through the transition from angry young officer to competent leader. He'd recommended me for Ranger School, sponsored my application for special operations support roles, and most importantly, taught me that respect in the military wasn't inherited or given. It was built, decision by decision, mission by mission. Ranger School had been the crucible that forged my identity as a soldier. 2 months of sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and constant evaluation under conditions designed to break down everything you thought you knew about yourself. I'd been one of only 3 women in my class, and the only one to graduate. The mountains of North Georgia had stripped away every pretense, every defense mechanism, every excuse I'd carried from civilian life. When you're leading a patrol through swampland at 3 in the morning, operating on 2 hours of sleep and a single MRE, nobody cares about your family problems. They care about whether you can read a map, make decisions under pressure, and get them home alive. I'd learned to trust my judgment, to speak with authority backed by competence, to lead from the front without apology. The woman who'd earned her Ranger tab was fundamentally different from the girl who'd left Denver. Not because the Army had changed me, but because it had revealed who I'd always been capable of becoming. My first deployment to Afghanistan as a captain had been the real test. Forward Operating Base Shank, in Logar Province, where the mission was to train Afghan National Army units while conducting counterinsurgency operations. I'd been assigned as the executive officer of a training battalion, responsible for coordinating operations between American advisors and Afghan forces. The work was complex, dangerous, and politically sensitive. We were building relationships with Afghan commanders who'd been fighting longer than most of my soldiers had been alive, earning their trust while maintaining operational security, adapting to cultural dynamics that shifted like desert sand. It was there that I'd first encountered Captain Jimmy Thompson. He'd been assigned to my battalion as a platoon leader, fresh from the 82nd Airborne and eager to prove himself in combat operations. Jimmy was everything the Army wanted in a junior officer: physically fit, tactically sound, and possessed of the kind of quiet confidence that made soldiers want to follow him into dangerous places. What set him apart was his respect for the chain of command and his genuine curiosity about different perspectives. While other young officers sometimes chafed under female leadership, Jimmy had approached our professional relationship with the kind of straightforward professionalism that made everything easier. "Ma'am," he'd said during one of our first briefings, "I've never served under a female field grade officer before. If I step wrong on protocol or cultural issues, please let me know. I'm here to learn." That honesty had been refreshing. Most male officers either overcompensated with exaggerated deference or tested boundaries to see how much they could get away with. Jimmy simply treated me like a competent superior officer and adjusted his behavior based on feedback, exactly what good soldiers do. The operation that would later bind our fates together had started as routine reconnaissance. Intelligence indicated insurgent activity in a village 12 kilometers from our base, and I'd tasked Jimmy's platoon with conducting a presence patrol to assess local sentiment and identify potential threats. What they'd found instead was an IED factory, hidden in what appeared to be an abandoned school building. Jimmy had called in the discovery and requested explosive ordnance disposal support, but the EOD team was tied up with another incident. Rather than wait and risk the insurgents moving their materials, Jimmy had made the decision to secure the site with his platoon. It should have been a textbook operation. Establish a perimeter, document the evidence, wait for specialized personnel to handle the disposal. But insurgents had been watching the building, and they'd rigged the entire structure as a trap. The explosion had brought down half the building. 2 of Jimmy's soldiers had been killed instantly, 3 others wounded, and Jimmy himself had been trapped under concrete and rebar with a compound fracture of his left leg and suspected internal injuries. That's when I'd made the decision that would echo through both our lives. Against protocol, I'd led the quick reaction force personally. I should have remained at the forward operating base, coordinating the response from our tactical operations center. Instead, I grabbed my gear and climbed into the lead vehicle, driven by an instinct that my presence on the ground could make the difference between a successful rescue and a catastrophic loss. The building had been unstable, threatening to collapse further with every movement. The insurgents were still in the area, taking potshots at our perimeter. Medevac helicopters couldn't land safely until we'd secured the site and extracted the casualties. I'd crawled into that rubble personally, following the sound of Jimmy's voice calling for his wounded soldiers. Found him pinned under a concrete beam, blood pooling beneath his leg, but still trying to direct his men to safety position. "Captain Thompson," I'd called out when I'd reached him, "I need you to stay still while we figure out how to move this beam." He'd looked up at me through dirt and blood, his face pale but alert. "Ma'am, my soldiers are being taken care of," I'd interrupted. "Right now, you're my priority." It had taken 43 minutes to extract him safely. 43 minutes of precision work with hydraulic tools while under sporadic enemy fire, coordinating with engineers to ensure we didn't bring down more of the building. 43 minutes during which Jimmy had remained conscious, professional, and more concerned about his men than his own injuries. When the medevac helicopter had finally lifted off with Jimmy aboard, he'd looked back at me standing in the debris field, saluted with his uninjured arm, and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you, ma'am." I'd never seen him again, until his name appeared on Sarah's wedding invitation. The years between that deployment and my current rank had been filled with increasingly complex assignments, advanced education, and the gradual accumulation of responsibility that came with success in the military. I'd commanded at every level from company through brigade, earned a master's degree in strategic studies, completed the Army War College, and been selected for promotion ahead of my peers. Each achievement had been its own validation, proof that the girl from Stapleton had been right to bet on herself. But none of it had filled the silence from home. Now, as I prepared for Sarah's wedding, I realized that my journey hadn't been about proving anything to my family. It had been about discovering who I was when stripped of their expectations and limitations. Major General Diana Martinez wasn't the woman my family had rejected. She was the woman their rejection had forced me to become. The taxi pulled up to the Cathedral of St. Andrew 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I'd chosen my timing carefully, late enough to avoid the pre-wedding mingling, but early enough to find a seat without causing a disruption. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, glanced at me in the rearview mirror as I handed him the fare. "Beautiful church," he said, studying the Gothic spires that stretched toward the overcast Denver sky. "Someone important getting married." "My sister," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my navy blue dress. I'd chosen civilian clothes deliberately, no uniform, no ribbons, no visible reminder of the career that had driven a wedge between me and this family gathering. Today, I was just Diana, Sarah's estranged older sister who'd flown in from Colorado Springs. The cathedral steps were bustling with late arrivals, women in pastel dresses carefully navigating the stone stairs in high heels, men adjusting ties and checking their phones one last time before the ceremony. I recognized some faces from my childhood neighbors, family friends, distant relatives who'd probably forgotten I existed. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down was struggling with her purse and a small wrapped gift. She'd aged considerably since I'd last seen her, gray hair replacing the auburn I remembered, but her smile was the same when she looked up and noticed me approaching. "Diana." Her voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if she wasn't quite sure she was seeing correctly. "Diana Whitman? My goodness, is that really you?" "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," I said, offering a genuine smile. "It's Martinez now. But yes, it's me." She set down her gift and pulled me into an unexpected hug. "Oh, my dear. Look at you. You look wonderful. How long has it been? 7 years? 8? Something like that," I replied diplomatically. "I heard you were in the military," she continued, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. "Are you stationed nearby?" "Your mother never mentioned." She stopped herself, probably remembering that my mother never mentioned me at all. "Colorado Springs," I said simply. I try to keep a low profile when I'm home. The awkward silence that followed was broken by the sound of organ music drifting from inside the cathedral. Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the entrance, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well," she said finally, "I'm sure your family is thrilled you could make it." Sarah always spoke so fondly of her big sister when she was growing up. I doubted that was still true, but I appreciated the kindness behind the lie. Inside, the cathedral was magnificent. Stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, and white roses adorned every pew end. The guest list was clearly substantial. The sanctuary was nearly full, with ushers directing the final arrivals to available seats. I scanned the crowd, noting the careful social geography of wedding seating. Military personnel were clustered together near the middle right side, easily identifiable by their posture and haircuts, even in civilian clothes. Jimmy's army friends, I assume. The family occupied the front sections, with what looked like Sarah's friends filling in the remaining premium real estate. An usher approached me, a young man in his 20s wearing a slightly ill-fitting tuxedo and an eager smile. His name tag read, Tyler, groomsman. "Are you here for the bride or groom?" he asked pleasantly. "Bride," I said. "Diana Martinez." He consulted his list, flipping through several pages with a frown. "Martinez. Martinez. I'm sorry, I don't see your name here." "Are you sure you're on the guest list?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel eyes turning toward us as other guests noticed the delay. Behind Tyler, I spotted another usher, older, more experienced, watching our interaction with interest. "I'm Sarah's sister," I said quietly, hoping to resolve the situation without a scene. Tyler's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize Sarah had a—" He caught himself, consulting his list again with renewed urgency. "Let me check with my supervisor." The older usher approached, extending his hand with military precision. "Ma'am, I'm Michael Rodriguez, Jimmy's best man. Is there some confusion about seating?" Rodriguez. The name triggered a memory. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the recruiter who'd first shown me Army brochures in the Lincoln High cafeteria 24 years ago. This had to be his son, or perhaps a nephew. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "I'm Diana Martinez," I said, shaking his hand. Sarah's sister. I'm afraid I wasn't included in the formal seating arrangements. Michael's expression shifted subtly, professional courtesy giving way to something that looked like recognition. Not of my face, but of my name. Martinez, he repeated slowly. From Colorado Springs. That's right. He studied me for a long moment, then glanced toward the altar where Jimmy was standing with the other groomsmen. When he looked back at me, his expression had changed completely. Ma'am, would you prefer to sit with family or with the military contingent? He asked formally. The question was diplomatic, but the undertone was clear. He knew who I was, even if the family seating chart didn't acknowledge my existence. Wherever there's space, I replied. Tyler, Michael said to the younger usher, please escort Ms. Martinez to row 12, center aisle. He turned back to me with a slight nod. Thank you for coming, ma'am. It means more than you might realize. Row 12 was exactly where I'd expected to be placed, far enough from the family section to maintain the illusion of my non-existence, but with a clear view of the proceedings. As I settled into the pew, I noticed several of the military guests turning to look at me. Word was spreading through their ranks like ripples in a pond. 2 rows ahead, I recognized Colonel Patricia Vance from the Pentagon, someone I'd worked with on Joint Task Force planning. She'd turned completely around in her seat and was staring at me with undisguised surprise. General Martinez, she whispered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. What are you doing here? Family wedding, I replied simply. The confusion on her face was evident. Patricia knew my professional reputation, had worked with me on high-level strategic planning, and had seen me brief senior Defense Department officials. The idea that I was related to anyone in this civilian gathering clearly didn't compute. Your family? She asked, glancing toward the altar where Jimmy was adjusting his boutonniere. To which side? The bride, I said quietly. Patricia's eyes widened. She turned to the officer sitting next to her, a man I didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested senior rank, and whispered something that made him turn to look at me as well. The organ music swelled, signaling the beginning of the processional. Conversations hushed as guests rose to their feet, but I could feel the continued weight of curious stares from the military section. Whatever they were thinking, whatever connections they were making, would have to wait until after the ceremony. The bridesmaids entered first, floating down the aisle in pale pink dresses that complemented the roses adorning the sanctuary. Sarah had chosen well. The color scheme was elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated enough for the cathedral setting. Then came Sarah herself, radiant on the arm of our Uncle Frank, who'd stepped in to walk her down the aisle after Dad's death. She was beautiful in the way that only truly happy brides can be, her smile genuine and unguarded as she approached the altar where Jimmy waited. Jimmy, seeing him again after all these years, was jarring. He was heavier than I remembered, broader through the shoulders, with lines around his eyes that spoke of responsibility and experience. But his posture was unmistakably military, and when Sarah reached the altar, he offered her his arm with the kind of gentle precision that marked him as a soldier even in civilian clothes. The ceremony began with traditional Episcopal liturgy, the priest's voice echoing through the vaulted space as he spoke about love, commitment, and the joining of 2 families. I wondered if Sarah had told Jimmy anything about our family history, about the sister who'd been systematically erased from family narratives. During the exchange of vows, Jimmy's voice carried clearly through the sanctuary. He spoke about second chances, about finding love when he'd thought his future might be limited by past injuries. He thanked Sarah for believing in him, for helping him rebuild his life after his medical retirement from the army. My throat tightened. He was talking about rebuilding his life after the injuries he'd sustained in Afghanistan. The injuries from the building collapse. The injuries that had ended his military career and led him to this moment, this wedding, this new beginning with my sister. Sarah never knew. She had no idea that the woman she'd spent years avoiding, the sister she'd helped erase from family photos and holiday cards, was the reason her husband was alive to marry her. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. When the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, the traditional moment of dramatic silence, my eyes met Jimmy's across the sanctuary. For just an instant, I saw recognition flicker across his face. Not certainty, but the beginning of memory trying to surface. Then the moment passed, the ceremony continued, and Jimmy Thompson kissed my sister as husband and wife while I sat alone in row 12, surrounded by his military friends, who were beginning to understand exactly who I was and why my presence here was more significant than anyone had realized. The Denver Country Club's grand ballroom was a study in understated elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of white hydrangeas and roses creating islands of sophistication throughout the room. The head table stretched along the far wall, elevated on a small platform that gave the wedding party a clear view of their guests, and, more importantly, gave the guests a clear view of them. I'd been seated at table 17, tucked into a corner near the service entrance where the catering staff moved efficiently between kitchen and dining room. The placement wasn't accidental, close enough to be technically present, far enough away to be easily ignored. My table mates were a collection of distant relatives and family friends who clearly hadn't been told about my existence. Their polite confusion when I introduced myself was almost comical. "I didn't know Sarah had a sister," said Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman wearing too much perfume and a hat that belonged in a different decade. "How wonderful that you could make it from— Where did you say you were from?" "Colorado Springs," I replied, cutting my salmon with deliberate precision. "Oh, that's not far at all. Do you work there?" The question hung in the air. I could have deflated it with something vague about government work or administration. Instead, I found myself saying, "I'm in the military. I work at Fort Carson." The conversation at table 17 died like someone had flipped a switch. Mrs. Chen's fork paused halfway to her mouth. A younger man I didn't recognize, someone's +1, judging by his discomfort with the formal setting, cleared his throat awkwardly. That's very admirable," said a woman across from me, her voice carrying the careful tone people use when they're not sure if they should be impressed or concerned. "What do you do in the military?" Before I could answer, the sound system crackled to life. The best man, Michael Rodriguez, was standing at the head table with a microphone in his hand, grinning broadly at the assembled guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It's time for toasts." The ballroom quieted as conversations paused and champagne glasses were raised. I noticed several military personnel at nearby tables turning to look at me, their expressions curious and increasingly intrigued. Word had definitely spread through their ranks about my identity, even if the civilian guests remained oblivious. Michael began with the traditional best man speech stories about Jimmy's bachelor party, misadventures, jokes about his tendency to iron his civilian clothes with military precision, heartfelt words about finding true love after facing mortality in combat. The audience laughed at the appropriate moments, dabbed their eyes during the sentimental portions, and raised their glasses when prompted. Then it was time for family toasts. My mother rose first, elegant in a powder blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Barbara Whitman had always known how to present herself for important occasions, how to project the image of a devoted mother and pillar of the community. She took the microphone with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this wonderful day," she began, her voice warm and melodious. "When Sarah was born, I knew she was special. She was such a beautiful baby, so well-behaved, so eager to please. As she grew up, she continued to be everything a mother could hope for: kind, loving, responsible, and devoted to family." The words hit like small, precise cuts. Each adjective was a comparison, a contrast to the daughter who wasn't being mentioned. Kind, unlike her difficult sister; loving, unlike her distant sister; devoted to family, unlike her sister who'd abandoned them for military service. "Sarah has always put family first," Mom continued, her eyes scanning the room but carefully avoiding table 17. "She's never let career ambitions or personal desires come between her and the people who love her. She understands that some things are more important than individual achievement." My champagne glass felt heavy in my hand. Around me, Table 17 was shifting uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Chen was frowning slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. And now she's found her perfect match in Jimmy, Mom went on, beaming at the groom. A man who shares her values, who understands the importance of loyalty and commitment. Jimmy, welcome to our family. You're getting a treasure in Sarah, a woman who knows how to stand by the people she loves, no matter what challenges life brings. The applause was enthusiastic, but I noticed several military guests exchanging glances. They were beginning to understand that something was happening here. Some family drama playing out in real time. Sarah stood next, accepting the microphone from our mother with a radiant smile. She was glowing with happiness, absolutely beautiful in her wedding gown, every inch the perfect bride. But as she began to speak, I caught something else in her expression. A calculated awareness of her audience that reminded me uncomfortably of our mother. "Thank you, Mom, for those beautiful words," Sarah said, her voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system. "I'm so grateful to be surrounded by everyone who matters most to me and Jimmy, the people who've been there for us, who've supported us, who've shown us what real love and loyalty look like." She paused, scanning the room with her eyes, and for a moment I thought she might acknowledge my presence. Instead, her gaze passed over table 17 without the slightest hesitation, as if it were occupied by strangers. "You know," Sarah continued, "growing up I learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to stay in your life, who prioritize your happiness, who don't abandon you when things get difficult." Her voice took on a slightly sharper edge, though her smile never wavered. "It's about the people who show up, not just physically, but emotionally, who are present for birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners, not just the big occasions when it's convenient." The room was completely quiet now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, sensing the tension that was building like electricity before a storm. "I'm so thankful," Sarah said, raising her champagne glass, "for a family that understands what commitment really means. A family that doesn't disappear when you need them most, that doesn't choose career over relationships, that doesn't make you feel like you have to choose between loving them and being proud of them." My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. She was doing this deliberately, methodically, using her wedding toast to deliver a public humiliation disguised as gratitude. And she was doing it with a smile that would photograph beautifully. "Some people," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone building to a climax, "think that success means accumulating titles and achievements. They think that wearing a uniform makes them special, that commanding other people gives them authority over their own families." She laughed lightly, as if the very idea was amusing. "But real success is measured in relationships, in loyalty, in the people who actually know you and love you anyway." Colonel Vance at table 12 was sitting rigidly upright, her face a mask of professional control that didn't hide her obvious anger. Other military guests were exchanging looks that ranged from confusion to outrage, as they began to understand that Sarah was publicly attacking someone in their community. "So here's to the family that matters," Sarah said, raising her glass higher. "The people who've earned their place at this table, who've proven their love through presence, not absence. The people who understand that you can't buy forgiveness with a last-minute appearance, and you can't substitute accomplishments for actual relationships." The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain. Some guests clapped enthusiastically, caught up in Sarah's energy without fully understanding her message. Others sat in uncomfortable silence, sensing that they'd witnessed something that shouldn't have happened in public. But at table 12, Colonel Vance wasn't clapping at all. She was staring directly at me with an expression of dawning understanding and barely contained fury. Beside her, the officer I didn't recognize was leaning forward, whispering urgently in her ear. And at the head table, Jimmy Thompson was looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not embarrassment, not anger, but something like recognition coupled with deep discomfort. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to understand that his wife had just used their wedding reception to publicly attack the woman who'd saved his life in Afghanistan. The microphone was being passed to him now, the next speaker in the traditional sequence of wedding toasts. Jimmy accepted it slowly, his eyes never leaving my face across the crowded ballroom. The room settled into expectant silence, waiting for the groom's speech. But Jimmy didn't begin with the usual jokes or romantic declarations. Instead, he stood quietly for a long moment, the microphone in his hand, looking like a man who'd just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried an undertone that made everyone in the ballroom lean forward slightly. "You know," he said, "I almost didn't make it to this wedding." Jimmy stood at the head table, microphone in hand, his words hanging in the air like a confession waiting to be born. The ballroom had gone completely still. Even the catering staff had frozen in place, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. "I almost didn't make it to this wedding," he repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Not because I got cold feet, not because I wasn't sure about marrying Sarah. I almost didn't make it because I should have died in Afghanistan 7 years ago." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at him with confusion, clearly not understanding where this was going. This wasn't the romantic, light-hearted groom's speech she'd been expecting. October 15, 2016. Jimmy continued, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. Forward Operating Base Shank, Lugar Province. My platoon was conducting reconnaissance on a suspected IED factory when the building we were searching collapsed. 2 of my soldiers died instantly, 3 others were wounded, and I was trapped under concrete and rebar with a compound fracture and internal bleeding. The military guests were leaning forward now, recognizing the cadence of an after-action report. Colonel Vance had gone completely rigid, her face pale as she began to understand what was happening. "The building was unstable," Jimmy said, his voice growing stronger. "Enemy forces were still in the area. Standard protocol would have been to wait for specialized equipment, for EOD teams, for a safer extraction method. But there wasn't time. I was bleeding out, and every minute delay meant a higher chance that more of the structure would collapse." Sarah's confusion was turning to alarm. She reached for Jimmy's arm, trying to interrupt, but he gently moved away from her touch, never breaking eye contact with me. "That's when my commanding officer made a decision that went against every safety protocol in the book," Jimmy continued. "She led the quick reaction force personally, crawled into an unstable building under enemy fire, spent 43 minutes extracting me while coordinating with engineers to prevent further collapse." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floors. "That commanding officer," Jimmy said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "was Lieutenant Colonel Diana Martinez. And she's sitting right there at table 17. The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Gasps, exclamations, chairs scraping as people turned to look at me, but Jimmy wasn't finished. He set down the microphone and walked around the head table, down the steps, and across the ballroom floor. Every eye in the room followed his movement as he approached table 17. When he reached me, he stopped exactly 1 pace away and came to attention. Then Captain James Thompson, retired, rendered a perfect military salute to the woman who had saved his life. "Major General Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I owe you my life, ma'am, and I owe you an apology for what just happened here." I stood slowly, returning his salute with the precision that had been drilled into me over 24 years of service. "Captain Thompson," I replied formally, "congratulations on your marriage." But Jimmy wasn't finished. He turned to face the room, speaking without the microphone but projecting his voice with military command presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I want you to meet Major General Diana Martinez, United States Army. The woman who saved my life, the woman who allowed me to be here today to marry the woman I love, the woman who has dedicated her life to serving our country with honor and distinction." The military section erupted. Colonel Vance shot to her feet, snapping to attention and rendering a crisp salute. One by one, every uniformed service member in the room stood and followed suit. The sound of chairs scraping and feet moving to attention positions filled the ballroom. Michael Rodriguez, the best man, had gone pale. He approached our table and I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. "General Martinez," he said quietly. "I believe you knew my father, Staff Sergeant Eduardo Rodriguez. He was the recruiter who showed me my first Army brochure," I finished. "24 years ago at Lincoln High School." "You have his eyes." Michael's composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am, he never stopped following your career. He has every article, every promotion announcement. He always said you were going to be something special." Around us, the civilian guests were struggling to process what they were witnessing. The elderly woman next to me, Mrs. Chen, was staring with her mouth slightly open. "You're a general?" she whispered. "A real general?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied gently. At the head table, Sarah had gone completely white. Our mother was clutching her purse like a lifeline, her carefully constructed composure crumbling as the reality of the situation crashed over her. Jimmy returned to the microphone, but this time Sarah tried to grab it from him. "Jimmy, please," she said, her voice barely audible but picked up by the sound system. "You don't understand the family dynamics." "I understand perfectly," Jimmy replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand that your family has spent years trying to erase the woman who saved my life. I understand that you just used our wedding reception to publicly humiliate a decorated war hero, and I understand that I've been complicit in that by not asking the right questions before today." He looked back at me, then at Sarah, then at the room full of guests who were watching the most dramatic wedding reception any of them had ever witnessed. "Sarah," he said into the microphone, "I love you, but I will not start our marriage by standing silent while you attack the person I owe everything to." The aftermath was swift and inevitable. Several military guests approached to introduce themselves, to express their honor at meeting me, to apologize for what they'd witnessed. Colonel Vance was particularly vocal in her outrage at my treatment. "General," she said formally, "this is absolutely unacceptable. I've served with you, I know your reputation, and what happened here tonight is a disgrace." My mother finally approached, her face a mask of mortification and desperate damage control. "Diana," she started. "Perhaps we could speak privately." "No," I said quietly but firmly. "We're past private conversations, Mom. We're past pretending this is about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. You made a choice 24 years ago about what kind of daughter you wanted, and you've spent every year since then trying to make me disappear because I refused to become her." Sarah was crying now, her perfect wedding makeup ruined. Her fairy tale evening collapsed around her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I didn't know," she whispered, approaching our table with Jimmy behind her. "I didn't know about Afghanistan, about what you did." "You never asked," I replied. "In 7 years, you never once asked what I did, where I served, or whether I was proud of my service. You decided I was selfish for choosing the military, and you never bothered to learn what that choice actually meant." Jimmy placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on me. "General Martinez," he said formally, "would you honor us by staying for the remainder of the reception?" I looked around the ballroom at the military officers standing at attention, at the civilian guests whispering among themselves, at my mother's stricken face, at Sarah's tears. "Thank you, Captain," I said, "but I think I've accomplished what I came here to do." I stood, gathered my small purse, and walked toward the exit. As I passed the head table, I paused next to Sarah. "Congratulations on your marriage," I said quietly. "I hope you'll both be very happy." Then I walked out of the Denver Country Club, out of my sister's wedding reception, and back into the life I'd built without them. 3 months later, I received a letter at Fort Carson. The return address was Jimmy and Sarah Thompson's new home in Colorado Springs. Inside was a single sentence in Jimmy's handwriting: "Thank you for showing me what honor really looks like." I never responded. Some lessons, once learned, don't require acknowledgement, but I kept the letter. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.